I retired early, sold the plumbing supply business I'd built over 34 years, and moved to coastal Maine. My ex-wife threw an engagement party 2 weeks after our divorce was finalized. My son gave the toast. He looked straight at me across the table and said, "Finally, a man who knows how to treat her right." Then 6 months later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning, and everything I'd quietly put in place began to fall. But to understand why I didn't answer that call, you have to go back to the Tuesday afternoon when I came home to find a stranger sitting at my kitchen table. His name was Conrad. I didn't know that yet. I just saw a man in his early 50s wearing a sport coat that was a size too small, sitting in the chair where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 26 years, drinking coffee from my favorite mug. My wife, Diane, we'd been married since Reagan's second term, was standing at the counter with her back to me, and she didn't turn around when I walked in. "Conrad," she said, "this is my husband." He stood up and extended his hand like we were meeting at a Chamber of Commerce mixer. I didn't take it. I looked at Diane. She still hadn't turned around. I set my keys on the counter, the same hook I'd screwed into the wall in 1991, and I said, "What is this?" She turned then, and I saw the look. I'd seen versions of it before, when I missed her mother's birthday for an emergency job in Bangor, when I forgot their anniversary during a cash flow crisis. But this was different. This wasn't frustration. This was the look of a woman who had already made her decision and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She said, "I'd been trying to find the right time to tell you." I looked at Conrad. He had the good sense to look at the floor. "There is no right time for this," I said. Her name was on the business license, too. 26 years of marriage, 2 kids, 1 company. I had built Halloran Plumbing Supply out of a single service van and a phone that rang maybe twice a day. By the time I handed the keys to a regional buyer, we had 4 warehouses, 42 employees, and accounts with every major contractor from Portland to Portsmouth. Diane had done the books for the first 12 years. She knew exactly what the business was worth. She knew exactly what I was worth. She wanted the lake house in Sebago. She wanted half the sale proceeds from the business, which hadn't sold yet but would. She wanted what she called the life I've been waiting for. She had our younger son, Joel, in her corner from the beginning. He was 26, restless, full of opinions about things he hadn't earned. He'd worked for the business one summer during college and spent most of it on his phone. He told me at dinner one night, 6 weeks after I found Conrad at my table, that I should just sign what needed signing and stop making it hard. "You made good money, Dad," he said. "You can start over." Start over. I was 63 years old. Our older son, Patrick, stayed quiet. He lived in Colorado, worked in commercial real estate, called maybe once a month. He wasn't taking sides, he was just absent, which felt like its own kind of verdict. I signed the papers. I gave her the lake house. I gave her the cash from the business sale, which went through 4 months later. I kept my truck, my tools, a storage unit full of equipment, and a modest checking account they didn't know the full balance of. I also kept something else, a holding company I'd set up 11 years earlier on the advice of my accountant, which held the mineral and water rights to a 40-acre parcel in Aroostook County that my father had left me, and which had just become suddenly interesting to a Canadian energy company doing exploratory work in the region. Nobody asked about that parcel. Nobody thought to. I moved into a rented house in Rockport on the Maine coast. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a porch that faced the water. I bought a used kayak. I started cooking for myself, real cooking, the kind where you stand over a cast iron pan and actually pay attention. I hadn't done that in decades. I hadn't done a lot of things. Before I left, I sat Joel down and tried to tell him what I'd found out about Conrad in the 3 months since he appeared at my table. I'd hired a private research firm out of Boston, not a detective, an actual research firm, the kind that does due diligence for investors. What they found was not good. 2 civil judgments in Massachusetts, a dismissed fraud complaint in New Hampshire, a pattern of short-term relationships with recently divorced women of means, followed by rapid financial entanglement, followed by the women being significantly poorer when it ended. "Joel," I said, "this man is not what he appears to be. I'm not saying this because I'm angry at your mother. I'm saying this because I have documentation. I slid the folder across the table. He didn't open it. He said, "You're just trying to wreck her happiness because you're bitter." I picked the folder back up. I said, "I hope I'm wrong." He said, "You are." I drove to Rockport that evening. The sun was going down over Penobscot Bay, and the water was the color of old copper. I sat on my porch and I thought about the fact that I had spent 34 years building things, a business, a house, a family, and all three of them now existed largely without me. I thought about my father, who had worked a potato farm in Aroostook County until his hands gave out, and who never once complained about the work. He told me once that the thing about building something is that you have to be willing to let it stand or fall on its own eventually. You can't hold it up forever with your own two hands. I thought about that for a long time. Then I went inside and made soup. The engagement party was in September. Diane and Conrad announced it at a dinner at a restaurant in Portland that Joel organized. I was not invited to the dinner, but I heard about it afterward from Patrick, who had flown in and who called me the next morning sounding uncomfortable. "They're moving fast," Patrick said. I said, "Yes, they are." He said Joel gave this whole toast about new beginnings and Conrad being good for her. I said, "I know." Long pause. Patrick said, "I didn't say anything. I don't know if that was right." I said it was your call to make. Another pause. Then he said, "Are you okay out there?" I told him I was better than I'd been in years. I meant it. The wedding was set for the following April. Our lake house, Diane's lake house now, technically, in Sebago. Joel was the best man. Patrick declined to attend, which I thought showed good judgment. I watched the ceremony from absolutely nowhere, because I wasn't there. But I did receive a text from Joel 2 days before, which said, "I hope you're not planning anything stupid. This is her day." I wasn't planning anything. I was in Rockport refinishing a dock for a neighbor, earning $400 I didn't particularly need. I had my phone on the workbench beside me when the text came in, and I read it and set the phone back down and kept sanding. What I was not doing was monitoring the situation, except that I was, a little. My research firm had continued to track Conrad's financial activity because they'd flagged something that warranted it. Specifically, a new LLC registered in Maine 2 weeks after the engagement was announced, with both Conrad's name and Diane's on it. The stated purpose was residential real estate investment. The collateral listed in the initial filing included the Sebago Lake House. He was moving to use the lake house as leverage for borrowed money before they were even married. I called my attorney, a woman in Augusta I'd worked with for 20 years. I told her what I'd found. She said, "Do you want to intervene?" I said, "Does Diane still own the house outright with no encumbrance?" She said, "Yes, technically, but if she signs anything with this LLC, she'll have exposure." I said, "Then we wait." She said, "That's cold." I said I offered her the folder 7 months ago. She said, "Fair enough." The wedding happened. I grilled salmon on my porch and watched the fog come in off the water. I did not toast anything. 3 days after the wedding, my research firm sent me a new alert. Conrad had applied for a home equity line of credit against the Sebago property, $600,000. He had listed himself as co-owner, which he now technically was as Diane's husband, and had attached documentation suggesting significant renovations were planned. The loan officer at the bank, as it happened, was a man named Tolliver who had financed 3 of my commercial properties years ago and who knew my signature better than most. He called me directly. He said, "I've got something on my desk with your ex-wife's properties that I want to run by you." I said, "What's the name on the application?" He said it. I said, "Process it slowly. Tell him the appraisal takes 3 weeks, tell him everything looks promising, and then call me when he comes in for the final signing." Tolliver said, "You sure about this?" I said, "I'll explain later." He said, "You always did play a long game." He wasn't wrong. What happened next came from a direction I hadn't fully anticipated, which is usually how the things that matter most arrive. Patrick called me on a Friday afternoon. He sounded like a man who had been holding something in for a while. He said, "I need to tell you something I probably should have said sooner." I said, "Go ahead." He said, I did some checking on Conrad myself, through a guy I work with who does commercial backgrounds for real estate transactions. And Dad, there's a woman in Connecticut. She divorced her husband in 2018. Conrad was her contractor. Within a year, they were together. Within 2 years, she'd signed over equity in her vacation property to an LLC he controlled. Within 3 years, she was in litigation trying to get it back. She lost. I said, I know about her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You knew. I said, I tried to tell your brother. Another silence. Then Patrick said, What do you need from me? I said, Nothing yet, but when things start moving, I may need you to be present for your mother. Not to say I told you so, just to be there when she needs someone. He said, I can do that. I said, I know you can. The call I got in April, 2 weeks before the loan was supposed to close, was not from Tolliver. It was from Joel. It was 2:17 in the morning, and the number was a number I didn't recognize, which meant he'd borrowed someone's phone. I lay in bed looking at the ceiling while it rang. I knew what was happening. I'd been watching the alerts come in for 6 days. Conrad had taken cash advances on 4 credit cards. He'd listed the lake house as his primary residence and applied for a second loan through a different lender, a private one, using Diane's signature on documents she had almost certainly not read carefully. The private lender had done a title search and found the first application at Tolliver's bank, which triggered a fraud flag, which triggered a call to the county register, which triggered an investigation by the state AG's Consumer Protection Division, which I'd personally tipped 3 weeks earlier with a packet of documentation that my research firm had assembled over 6 months. It happened fast after that, the way things do when you prepared the ground carefully and then just waited. I let Joel's call go to voicemail. He called back on a number I recognized, his own, 4 minutes later, which meant he'd found his phone. I let that one go too. Then came a text, Dad, please pick up. Mom needs you. Conrad got arrested. The police are at the house. Please. I got up and made coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the first gray light come up over the water. A lobster boat was working the traps about a quarter mile out. I watched it for a while. Then I called Patrick. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been awake. I know, he said. I'm already in the car. Portland is 2 hours from Sebago. I said, don't say anything about knowing in advance. Just be there. He said, I understand. I said, take care of your mother. He said, I will. And Dad, thank you for not doing it the other way. I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, but I thought I understood. I did not go to Sebago. I sat with my coffee, and I let the thing I'd built, quietly, methodically, the way I'd built everything in my life, do what it was designed to do. Conrad was arraigned on charges of mortgage fraud and identity theft. He had used Diane's signature on documents without her knowledge, which she was able to demonstrate because she had been in Boston with her sister on 2 of the dates the documents were supposedly signed. The private lender filed a civil complaint. Tolliver's bank filed a separate one. The Connecticut woman's attorney filed a motion to reopen her case based on the new charges. By June, Conrad was facing 3 civil actions and 2 criminal counts in 2 states. Diane called me herself on a Sunday morning from what I assume was the lake house. Her voice was different from the last time I'd heard it, which had been outside our attorney's office 18 months earlier. The certainty was gone, not replaced by softness exactly, more like sand that's had the tide run over it a few times. Still there, still the same material, but the edges were different. She said, I know you don't owe me anything. I didn't say anything. She said, I need to know if the house is at risk. The attorney can't tell me how much exposure I have until the civil case shakes out. I said, you need to pull the LLC filings and read the specific language of what you signed. Do you still have your own attorney? She said, I have the one from the divorce. I said, call her today, not Monday, today. Tell her to request an emergency review of the title status and get ahead of the civil lien before it attaches. Silence. She said, how do you know all of this? I said the same way I knew to give you the folder about him 14 months ago. Longer silence. She said I should have read it. I said yes. She said Edmund would never have done this to me. I stopped. I said, I'm sorry? She said in the folder you gave Joel, you called him Edmund, one of the victims in Connecticut. I realized she meant a woman in the file whose husband was also named Edmund. I'd forgotten that detail. I said, that's her ex-husband's name, not mine. She said, oh. She laughed a little, which surprised me. It was a sad laugh. She said, I confused myself. Then she said, thank you for the advice. You didn't have to. I said, call your attorney. She said she would. Then she said, Patrick told me you've been okay up there. I said, better than okay. She said, good, you deserve that. I didn't know what to do with that, so I said, take care of yourself, Diane, and I meant it. By August, the criminal case had moved into a plea negotiation, and Conrad, whose real name turned out to be a variation with a middle initial that he dropped when he moved to New England, accepted a deal. 4 years, eligible for parole in 18 months, full restitution to both lenders, surrender of assets including a boat I hadn't known about and 2 storage units in Massachusetts whose contents told their own story about how he operated. Joel called me a week after the plea was announced. He didn't apologize directly. Joel isn't built that way. Not yet, maybe someday. What he said was, I looked at the folder. I said, okay. He said, you tried. I said, I did. He said, I thought you were just being... He stopped. He said, I thought the wrong thing about why you were doing it. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry I told you to just sign and move on. That was as close as he'd get for now, and I understood that. I said, you were protecting your mother the way you knew how to at the time. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, are you coming back to visit? I said, not this year, but maybe next spring if the weather cooperates. He said, I'd like that. I said, me too. The holding company situation resolved itself in October. The Canadian Energy Company finalized an easement agreement for the Aroostook parcel, not a sale, an easement, which my accountant had recommended for tax purposes, and the payment was enough to buy a small house outright if I'd wanted to. What I did instead was fund the endowment for a trade scholarship at the Technical College in Rockland. They named a welding bay after my father, which I thought he would have found both funny and appropriate. I didn't announce any of this. There was no event, no ribbon cutting, no photograph. I wrote the check and the dean of the college sent me a letter, and I pinned the letter to the wall above my workbench in the garage. A woman I'd met at a boat restoration workshop in Camden. Her name was Frances. She was 61, a former maritime attorney who'd retired and taken up woodworking, had asked me once, early on, if I was angry about how things had gone. We were standing in her workshop. She was fitting a new thwart into a 14-foot dory, and I was watching her work, which was precise and unhurried, and I thought about the question for longer than she probably expected. I said I was angry for about 6 months after I found him in my kitchen. Then I realized that the anger was costing me more than it was costing anyone else. She said, so you just let it go? I said, no, I let it settle. Those aren't the same thing. She looked up from the dory. She said, what's the difference? I said, letting it go means you stop caring what happens. I still cared. I just stopped letting the caring make my decisions. I made a plan instead. I stayed patient. I let the structure of the thing do what it was going to do when it was ready. She held that for a moment. Then she said, you sound like a contractor. I said I spent 34 years as one. She smiled and went back to fitting the thwart. It was a good smile. I noticed it the first time she'd done it, and I'd been noticing it since. There's a thing that happens when you get to 63 and you spent most of your adult life solving problems that other people created, and you finally stop, not give up. Stop. There's a difference there too. Giving up is exhaustion. Stopping is a decision. I decided to stop being the person who fixed the damage that other people's choices created. I decided to let the consequences find the people who earned them. That's not revenge. I want to be honest about that, because the word revenge implies heat, implies satisfaction in watching someone suffer, implies that you needed their pain to feel okay. I didn't feel that way watching Conrad's case move through the system. I felt something closer to the feeling you get when you've done a job correctly, a pipe that doesn't leak, a joint that holds, a foundation that doesn't settle. Not excitement, just rightness. The hard part, the part that doesn't resolve cleanly, is the sun's. Patrick and I talk every 2 or 3 weeks now. He came up in November and we went out on the boat and didn't talk about any of it, just talked about the water and the weather and a book he'd been reading and a project I was working on. That was good. That was the kind of good that's quiet and doesn't need to explain itself. Joel is harder, not impossible, just slower. He's 27 now, and he's starting to understand that you don't get shortcuts to respect, that you have to show up and do the unsexy work of being reliable before anyone trusts you with the important things. He's working for a contractor in Brunswick, which I think is good for him in ways he doesn't fully recognize yet. He's learning what things cost, not in money, but in time and labor and the particular kind of honesty that comes from having to stand behind what you've built. He called me last month from a job site. Background noise, compressors, someone shouting about lumber. He said, "Hey, quick question. How do you know if a subfloor is worth saving or if you should just pull it?" I said, "What does it sound like when you walk on it?" He described the hollow spots, the soft areas near the load-bearing wall. I said, "Bullet never put new work on a compromised foundation." He said, "Yeah, that's what I figured, just wanted a second opinion." I said, "Trust your read." He said, "Okay." He said, "Thanks, Dad." Then the compressor sound took over and he was gone. I sat with that for a while after the call ended. I thought about all the years I'd given advice that nobody wanted, and how strange it was to be asked for advice now, on a Tuesday afternoon, from a job site, about a subfloor. I thought about how much ground we still had to cover, Joel and I, and how it would take time and probably more conversations like that one. Practical, sideways, with the real thing hiding underneath the surface question. But the foundation was there, damaged in places, yes, a few hollow spots, but worth saving. Frances came over that evening. She brought a bottle of wine from a vineyard in Whitefield she'd discovered. We sat on the porch and watched the last light go out over the water, and she told me about a commission she'd just accepted, a set of oars for a racing shell, and I told her about Joel's call. She listened, the way she listened to everything, like she was figuring out the load-bearing wall in what you were saying, where the real weight was sitting. When I finished, she said, "He called you." I said, "He did." She said, "That's the thing." I said, "Yeah." She poured more wine, and we sat with that for a while, and the water went dark, and the lights of the boats came on, and somewhere across the bay a foghorn started, slow and steady, like something enormous reminding you it was there. I thought about my father and his potato fields. I thought about the first van I bought, second-hand, engine light always on. I thought about the 42 employees who'd had health insurance because of what I built. I thought about Diane at her kitchen counter not turning around, and Conrad's hand extended across my table, and the folder Joel wouldn't open, and the night I drove to Rockport and watched the fog come in and decided that I would stop holding up things that needed to fall. I thought about a scholarship in a welding bay with my father's name on it, and a woman who cared about how a dory was built, and a son who called from a job site about a subfloor. And I thought, this is what it feels like when the load is distributed correctly. Not light, not easy, just right. You build things your whole life, and you hope they stand. Some of them do. Some of them you let fall because holding them up was destroying the parts of you that actually mattered. The trick. The one I didn't figure out until I was 63 years old and watching the sun go down over Penobscot Bay is knowing the difference before it's too late. I picked up my glass. Frances was looking at the water. I said, "Nice wine." She said, "I know." The foghorn went again, long and low and untroubled by anything we'd made a mess of. There's a moment near the end of all this that I keep coming back to. Not the arrest, not the call from Tolliver, not even Joel's voice from that job site asking about a subfloor. It's the moment I sat in my truck outside my own house after finding Conrad at my kitchen table, and I made a decision not to react, not to shout, not to do the thing that every nerve in my body was pushing me toward. I just drove away and started thinking. I spent a long time believing that doing the right thing would be enough, that if I worked hard and stayed honest and built something real, the people around me would recognize it. Diane didn't leave because I failed her. She left because she confused stability for stagnation and mistook a man who didn't need to prove himself for a man who had nothing to prove. That's a distinction that costs you when you get it wrong. Conrad knew exactly which version she believed, and he sold her the other one. What I understand now, at 63, is that integrity isn't a transaction. You don't do the right thing because it comes back to you. You do it because it's the only way to live with yourself when things fall apart, and things always fall apart eventually. When I handed my attorney that research packet on Conrad, when I called Tolliver and told him to slow the loan, I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to make sure the truth had enough room to surface before it got buried under someone else's paperwork. That's not revenge. That's just patient, honest work. The same kind I'd been doing in plumbing supply for 3 decades. Joel is the part of this I'm still working through. He had the folder in his hands and he chose not to open it, and I understand why. He wanted to believe in something exciting, something that looked like success from the outside. I did the same thing at 26. The difference is that the consequences of his choice landed on him directly, and that's not a comfortable thing for a father to watch. But I've come to believe that being willing to let your son experience the weight of his own decisions is one of the harder and more necessary things a parent can do. Rescuing him again would have taught him nothing except that the floor would always hold, no matter how recklessly he danced. The scholarship in Rockland, the welding bay with my father's name on it, that's the part that sits right with me. Not because it's grand, it isn't, but because it took real discipline to save quietly for 11 years, to not spend what was in that holding company on things that felt good in the moment, and to use it finally on something that outlasts me. That's the kind of decision you can only make if you've been practicing delayed gratification your whole life. If you trained yourself to ask not what feels satisfying now, but what holds up. Frances asked me once if I thought things worked out the way they were supposed to. I told her I don't think the universe keeps score. I think people make choices, and choices have consequences. And if you pay close enough attention, you can usually see it coming. Conrad made a long career out of finding women who were distracted by emotion and not looking at the fine print. The fine print is always where it lives. What I'd tell anyone who sees themselves in this story is simple. Don't wait until you're standing in someone else's rubble to start reading carefully. The people who are worth trusting don't need you to look away. They hand you the documents and they wait. I'm not a patient man by nature. I had to learn it, and I'm still learning it every time Joel calls from a job site with a question he already knows the answer to. Every time Frances looks at a piece of wood and figures out what it's trying to become. Some things take time to cure properly. The ones that hold are always the ones you didn't rush.